So welcome everybody. My name is Renee Frost. I'm the education officer at the Society. I work for the Society directly, and I'm here today with Laura. So I just wanted to say, we're going to kick off the session by encouraging everybody to take a moment to become aware of the places that we're all sitting today to gather for these sessions. It's really easy for us to lose sight of whose land we're actually occupying. Long before we occupied these spaces, before we called these places that we sit in today home or the office, these lands, these places and spaces were all sustained by Indigenous people. Indigenous people who understood that taking from and giving back to the land are equally important. So while we're not certain where each of you are sitting today, we are certain that all the places that we sit in were taken, stolen, or otherwise seized from Indigenous people under the guise of mutual benefit and goodwill. Indigenous commitments, which were meant to allow settlers to use, be sustained by, and access the land, were twisted into land surrender arrangements, leaving Indigenous peoples without access to the land or resources that were stolen from them. There are many treaties that cover the province of Ontario, and we invite you to take a moment to log into nativeland.ca to find which treaty covers the land that you are occupying today. And if you like, you can share that in the chat. So I will continue on while you're doing that. For those of you that I haven't had the pleasure of meeting, I'm going to be here today assisting Laura Brownell. Again, I'm the education officer at the Society. And as some of you might be aware, there were limited registration spots for today's session, and it filled up really quick. So to accommodate the overwhelming response, we did increase the number of seats available. And because of that, we're asking that questions be held until the end. We will have a Q&A period at the end of today's session, as well as at the end of tomorrow's. But I will be monitoring the chat for clarification questions about Laura's presentation. So Laura does not have the chat open on her screen, but if you have a question where you require clarification, maybe there's a shorthand version of a term used that you're not sure of, please feel free to put that in the chat. And I will ask Laura for clarification on your behalf. And again, Q&A will be at the end. And at the end, I will be taking questions from the from the chat for Laura, as well as just general questions that we think that might be of interest. I know we have a couple of those handy. Okay. I have the pleasure now of introducing my colleague, Laura Brownell. So Laura has been a staff member with the Society since 2008, and her responsibilities include providing advice and support on pension matters for all locals. And she recently took a 1-year leave of absence to work as a senior research officer for CUPE. And during that time, she was appointed to the sponsor board for Ontario's University Pension Plan and participated in its development. Laura is also an active member of the Ontario Federation of Labor's Pension Committee and the Canadian Labour Congress Pension Advisory Committee. And she also serves on a pension technical advisory committee for the provincial regulator. Laura holds a Master's of Industrial Relations from the University of Toronto and an Osgoode Hall Pension Law Certificate. So welcome, Laura. I'm so excited for the session. I can't wait. I'm going to hand the floor over to you now, and I will mute, but I will keep an eye on the chat for folks that need some assistance.
Thank you very much, Renee. I'm going to share my screen now. And we'll put this in presentation mode as soon as I can see the button. So I don't know why that bar won't go away, Renee. It did 5 minutes ago.
Which bar is that, Laura? Is it the one with?
I've got the black bar at the top where it invites me to mute and share and all that stuff. I don't want to pause share, but I can no longer see the presentation bar. It's hidden.
Oh, can you drag that bar down? Maybe.
Oh, I can drag it over. Here we go. All right. Oops, that wasn't supposed to happen. Here we go. All right. I think we are set.
Oh, Laura, one second. Sorry, sorry, I had a question in the chat and I apologize. I should have mentioned this at the beginning. So thank you very much, Alex. Yes, the presentation, recording, and the audio plus these slides and the recording will all be placed on the Society's e-learning system, which everybody, all our members have access to, and we will be providing instructions on how to access that after this meeting. So sorry, I forgot to mention that. Over to you, Laura.
Okay, thank you. So greetings to everyone. I'm really looking forward to spending a couple of hours with you this week to talk about a mostly happy and very important topic, which is pensions. Today's session will be a general overview that includes the topics that you see on this slide. DB and DC refer to the two prevailing types of pension plans, defined benefit and defined contribution pension plans. Some of today's material may be familiar to you, but I think it's important to review the basics. Here's where I want to add the fact that we've developed two different versions of these sessions. Earlier this month, we presented sessions on defined benefit pension plans, and this session today is the same day one of the general and contextual information, but tomorrow's session will take you on a deeper dive into specifically defined contribution pension plans. So I note that most of the attendees on the list, which I only received this morning, actually participate in defined benefit pension plans, but it's very possible that many of you have partners who are in defined contribution plans, or you just simply have a general interest. So again, today will be general background contextual information, some history, and tomorrow we'll have a specific defined contribution focus. Recent studies have underscored the importance to Canadians of having a secure income in retirement. People who do not have a guaranteed, predictable stream of income may hoard rather than spending their money out of fear of outliving their savings. This is bad for retirees, but it's also bad for the economy. We will explore today how the different types of pension plans are more or less successful in providing a secure lifetime income. Your pension plan is an important part of your lifetime income, and you should think of it as deferred wages, something that you have earned and that you are entitled to. Conventional wisdom pegs the retirement goal at around 70% of pre-retirement earnings for the reasons shown on this slide. Put simply, your costs will likely be lower in retirement. The 70% number is controversial and probably not static. Many retirees will spend more during their earlier or active years, although expenses can rise in later years if long-term care is required. Canada's retirement system is often referred to as a three-legged stool. The first leg is government programs such as the Canada Pension Plan and the Old Age Security Program. Second leg is workplace pension plans, and the third is personal savings, which can include equity in your home. Most working Canadians participate in the Canada Pension Plan. The modest CPP enhancement that is currently being phased in will help, but government programs such as Canada Pension Plan and Old Age Security will still fall far short of providing a secure retirement. Workplace plans and personal savings will still have to do a lot of the heavy lifting. Registered pension plans are governed by legislation that sets out minimum standards. The Pension Benefits Act is the statute for plans regulated in Ontario, and the Pension Benefit Standards Act is the statute for federally regulated plans. The PBSA is relevant to the society. We have two locals that are in federally regulated plans, and that's Bruce Power and the Nuclear Waste Management Organization. The federal jurisdiction is for pension plans in federally regulated industries such as banks, transportation, and yes, nuclear energy. That is why Bruce Power and NWMO fall under federal rules. Let's look at a couple of definitions on this slide here. Locked in means that in a registered pension plan, the funds cannot be withdrawn before retirement. The purpose of these plans is to provide a pension. Held in trust, this is extremely important. This means that the money in the pension fund is for the sole purpose of providing pensions to plan beneficiaries. Those funds are protected even in the context of bankruptcy. Pension plans must be registered under two pieces of legislation. One is the Income Tax Act, and one is either the PBA or the PBSA, depending on the jurisdiction. The Income Tax Act protects the public purse and is concerned with maximum contribution levels and deductibility. The other statutes set minimum requirements for pensions. Employers can provide more than the legislation requires, and the parties can negotiate a greater right. But the pension plan cannot provide less than the minimum standards set out in the legislation. And again, the Income Tax Act is mostly concerned with contribution levels and how much you can deduct. The Federal Income Tax Act encourages employers to provide an employment-based retirement income arrangement by giving them favorable but limited tax treatment. So in other words, the government's happy to help out, but they still want their money. So the Income Tax Act regulates and places limits on the items you see here: benefit accrual, in other words, how fast you earn your pension, early retirement subsidies, indexation, which is cost of living adjustments, how much of your contributions you can deduct from your taxable income, and also tax sheltered transfers. So the early retirement subsidies and indexing do not apply in the context of a defined contribution plan, but the rules for deductibility and tax sheltered transfers do apply and will be discussed in more detail tomorrow.
Laura?
Yes.
We have a question for clarification. We're being asked, is OPG PBSA or PBA?
That's a really interesting question. Because one would think, because OPG is involved with the nuclear industry, that it would be federal. And in fact, at a certain point, I believe, back many years ago, that there were aspects of the OPG pension plan that were in one jurisdiction or the other. In other words, whether it was nuclear or non-nuclear. An arrangement was made. I don't know the nature of the discussion, but the parties did agree many years ago that OPG pension plan would be governed by provincial regulation, and that is the situation today. But a very good question. Pensions are also regulated by entities in each jurisdiction that are mostly there for the benefit of the plan beneficiaries. The Financial Services Commission of Ontario, until very recently, was the pension regulator for Ontario, FSCO as it was known. It has been replaced by FSRA, the Financial Services Regulatory Authority, which is a new agency that assumed FSCO's responsibilities effective April 2019. FSRA has broader powers than FSCO had and actually has rule-setting powers. They've been actively engaged in updating and combining a lot of the regulatory guidance that FSCO provided, and they are very active in engaging with stakeholders. Then for federally regulated plans, we have the Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions, OSFI. That's the regulator for plans in the federal jurisdiction. Relevant to participants in defined contribution pension plans is the fact that FSRA and OSFI have recently joined forces and formed a joint stakeholder committee to specifically look at defined contribution plans. That committee has already made several recommendations and they will be discussed tomorrow. CAPSA guidelines. It's a kind of a mouthful, Canadian Association of Pension Supervisory Authorities. So that would be all of the provincial and federal regulators combined into a national association. Their role is a very important one. They develop regulatory policies and guidelines to improve pension plan administration, support administrators in meeting their fiduciary duty, because under registered pension plans, the administrator is a fiduciary for the benefit of the plan beneficiaries, and their main purpose is to enhance protection to pension plan members. The guidelines are voluntary, but there's a bit of a caveat. They're considered to embody best practices in pension administration. When I say considered, I mean that arbitrators and tribunals take the CAPSA guidelines very seriously. Standard advice from pension lawyers to pension plan administrators is that they would ignore the CAPSA guidelines at their peril. The next few slides will illustrate the pros and cons of the two most common types of pension plans, defined benefit and defined contribution. We will also look at a different plan design that falls between defined benefit and defined contribution on the pension spectrum, and they are called target benefit plans. Most society represented employees do not yet have much experience with target benefit plans, but it's important to talk about them because they are designed to address problems with defined contribution and defined benefit plans. Defined contribution plans are often not successful at providing adequate retirement income. On the other hand, defined benefit plans are expensive and complex for employers, and as a result, those plans are constantly under pressure by employers. If they have the ability to close them or alter them, they do. If they have to negotiate with unions, they work very hard to try to do that. We mostly have defined benefit plans in the electricity sector. That is unusual, and you'll see later that these plans have become a bit of an outlier, but the society values these plans. They are very good, generous plans, and we work hard to preserve the benefits that they give for our members. Defined contribution plans, as the name suggests, they provide a specified level of contributions that typically go into individual capital accumulation accounts. For registered defined contribution plans, both employers and employees contribute to these accounts to a combined maximum of 18% of pensionable earnings. There is no pension guarantee at the end of a career. It is just a pile of money. It is up to the retiree to figure out how the money can be used to provide income in retirement. In contrast, again, as the name suggests, a defined benefit plan provides a guaranteed income for life from a pooled fund. There are no individual accounts. Target benefit pension plans are not new. They have long been in existence in sectors where workers have multiple employers, such as construction and entertainment. But target plans are enjoying a resurgence as employers and workers look for alternatives to defined benefit and defined contribution plans. Target benefit plans have attributes of both defined contribution and defined benefit. They're like defined benefit plans in that the pension is based on a formula and contributions are pooled. They are like defined contribution plans in that contributions are fixed and there is no pension guarantee. Target pensions can be reduced even for retirees in the event of a funding shortfall. There are only two ways for a pension plan to address a funding shortfall, which is where a plan's assets are not sufficient to provide the promised benefit. A plan can either add money to the plan or they can reduce benefits to make sure that the assets and the liabilities match up. Because target benefit contributions are fixed, typically as a percentage of pensionable earnings, benefit reductions are the only way to address a shortfall. I should say it's not common, and there are funding rules in place to try and ensure that that happens as infrequently as possible, but it can happen. Defined benefit and target benefit plans are vastly more efficient at generating retirement income because of the power of pooling. Individuals with defined contribution accounts need to assume maximum longevity, which means you've got to assume that you're going to live to be 105, and you might need to de-risk your portfolio as retirement approaches to avoid the impact of some sort of black swan event like a drastic market downturn. On the other hand, defined benefit and target plans only have to fund to the average longevity because they're pooled, and also because of pooling, they do not need to de-risk. They can stay fully invested, which typically will result in better returns. So what happens if there's a funding shortfall? Pension plans can become underfunded due to various factors, such as market downturns, In defined contribution and target plans, the workers bear all of the risk of a funding shortfall because the contributions are fixed. So the only way to solve the problem is to reduce the benefits. In single employer defined benefit plans, the employer must make up the shortfall through special payments to the fund. The situation is a bit more complicated for jointly sponsored pension plans. You'll see a reference to them down here. We got into quite a bit of detail about those in the defined benefit sessions earlier this month because we do have many members that are in jointly sponsored plans. These plans are basically the big public sector and broader public sector plans that many of you will have heard of, which are for teachers in the healthcare sector with HOOP, or the OPSU Trust for the public service workers. There are a number of these very large jointly sponsored plans. Most of these large plans are also moving away from guaranteed indexing and adopting a conditional indexing formula, which means that indexing can be adjusted or withheld in the event of fund shortfall. But in every other respect, they do provide a defined benefit. This slide shows where the risk lies in the three types of plans. So in defined contribution and target benefit plans, the plan members do bear most or all of the risk because shortfall will result in benefit reductions. And in the 180-degree difference, defined benefit plans, if there's a shortfall, the employers bear all of the risk. It is important, though, to look at the asterisk here. Members are exposed to insolvency risk in some cases. Accrued benefits in a defined benefit plan can be reduced in the context of bankruptcy. You have all heard about Nortel and Sears. A more recent and more disturbing example is the recent insolvency of Laurentian University. Until that happened, no one thought that a public sector institution like a university would experience insolvency and reductions to earned pensions. But in situations where insolvency risk is low, defined benefit pensions are secure. And I want to add, there's a common misconception that people can lose their pensions in bankruptcy. They don't lose their pensions. What happens is if there's a shortfall in the funding, their pension will be reduced to the level of funding, so that if a plan is 75% funded, they would get 75% of their pension as opposed to 100. But they would never lose all of it. And in Ontario, for defined benefits, we have a guarantee fund, which helps to top that up. But in situations where insolvency risk is low, defined benefit pensions are secure, and that's important to remember. So I thought we should spend a little bit of time talking about how we got to where we are today with pensions in Canada. How did people manage in old age in the days before pension plans? Here's what planning for your golden years used to look like. If you were lucky, you could rely on family. There's Grandpa over in the corner there, and hopefully all these other people are taking good care of him. The less fortunate might end up in a poorhouse. In Canada, a poorhouse with an attached farm was the favored model for housing people who were destitute, disabled, or old and infirm. Or you could always just work until you drop, or line up for a nice hot bowl of soup. Pressure for reform began to build in the mid-20th century. The great debate began and continues to this day between those on the left politically who advocate for universal public plans such as the Canada Pension Plan, and those on the right who believe in private sector solutions and individual self-reliance. It is not surprising that banks and insurance companies prefer the individual approach, which will typically be a defined contribution plan or a group RSP in the context of a workplace plan. A middle-class deal began to emerge. After a lifetime of work, you should be able to retire with security and dignity. I think there is consensus in Canadian society that workers should be able to expect a secure retirement. We just don't necessarily agree on how to achieve that. Now, from the mid-50s, we look at how things started to progress. First came the Old Age Security Program in 1952. It's a universal program. It's paid from government operating funds. Down at the bottom here, the Guaranteed Income Supplement is means tested. and in combination with the old age security program has been credited with dramatically reducing the incidence of senior poverty in Canada. And of course, we have the Canada Pension Plan, which is funded by workers and their employers. I've got a number of 25% replacement rate here. I should add that the Canada Pension Plan income replacement rate will increase to 33.3% when the 2016 expansion is fully implemented. Then in the 1960s through the 1980s came the rise of defined benefit pension plans. Defined benefit plans rapidly became the most common form of pension plan. There's an excellent book by Elizabeth Shelton called Empty Promises, in which she explains that these defined benefit plans were not adopted out of the kindness of employers' hearts. They were there to serve their business needs, to attract and retain talent, and then help that same talent out the door when the employer felt that it was time for them to go. But even then, there were problems. In far too many cases, workers who left employment before retirement got nothing from their pensions. These problems were addressed in the mid-80s through regulation. In Ontario, looking at the first bullet here about reduced vesting requirements, it used to be in Ontario that there was a 10-year vesting requirement that was reduced then to 2 years, and more recently, there is no vesting period at all. What does that mean? This means for defined contribution participants that the workers who terminated employment even before 2 years would get all of their pension back, including the amounts that the employer had contributed. Before, if you weren't vested in your pension, you would only get your own contributions back. But now, like I said, we have full and immediate vesting. The second bullet here, enhanced funding requirements, does not apply to defined contribution plans because in those plans, the employer's obligation is only to contribute a specified percentage of earnings into individual accounts. But the last bullet does apply to defined contribution plans, and we'll talk about that tomorrow. So this improved system of reform worked well through the boom years of the 1990s when most pension plans were in surplus. But then came the perfect storm of the Great Recession. In 2008 and 2009, we had the massive stock market downturn. Pension fund asset values plunged along with the stock market. Liabilities soared because people were living longer and therefore collecting their defined benefit pensions for more years. And defined benefit pension liabilities were highly sensitive to the low interest rate environment. Defined benefit plans went into deficit. As costs for employers rose dramatically, those that could began to close their defined benefit plans, and defined contribution became the prevailing model. The great exodus from DB to DC began. The numbers on this slide are the most current available from Statistics Canada. As you can see from the second bullet point here, public sector workers are well supported by a number of large jointly sponsored defined benefit pension plans, and that number at 88% is stable. The biggest changes have been with private sector employers. Now, only 9% of private sector workers participate in a defined benefit pension plan, and of those, many of them are in plans that are closed to future accruals. In other words, they have been frozen and closed and moved into a different type of arrangement, often defined contribution. This slide and the next show the types of pension plans that we have in society locals. All of the Ontario Hydro successor companies continue to offer traditional defined benefit plans, but most of our more recently organized employers offer defined contribution, or in some cases, simply cash. And on the next slide, we see some more. These are simply in alphabetical order. There have been, I'm sorry, just so you know, DB/SEPP, that stands for Defined Benefit Single Employer Pension Plan, and those will be all of the Ontario Hydro legacy plans. There have been several spin-offs and amalgamations in recent years. The Ontario Energy Board was spun off from the Ontario Public Service. I'll just go back to that slide. Oh, sorry, it's on the next one. In another case, the Ontario Power Authority workers merged with the independent electricity system operator. That happened in around 2015. And as you can see in that case, we did have a number of people who are deferred vested. In other words, they kept their former service, their OPA service, in the public sector plan, and then on a going forward basis are in the IESO plan. Also in 2017, Connectrix acquired Nuclear Safety Solutions, and again, that resulted in a plan merger. And most recently, a really good news story is that energy workers have been repatriated into Hydro One and have joined that pension plan. Each of these situations presents unique challenges in determining how pensions will be handled. I was asked to discuss the pros and cons of defined benefit and defined contribution plans. This was not an easy task because although both types of plans are vastly better than having no plan at all, the advantages of the defined contribution model fall mostly to employers. So for defined benefit plans, there are many wonderful attributes. The most important one being right here at the top, guaranteed lifetime income. You cannot outlive your money with these kinds of plans. By law, they must include survivor benefits. They might include cost of living adjustments, although that's not a statutory requirement. The employer bears all of the investment risk, all of the funding risk, and also the pooled longevity risk, meaning that the plans only have to fund for the average lifespan and can stay fully invested. Things can go wrong in a defined benefit plan. Like we mentioned before, if the company goes bankrupt or if they simply mismanage the fund, which does happen, the pensions can be affected. Again, Sears, Nortel, Laurentian are recent history examples. Another ongoing issue in bargaining is the constant pressure from employers who demand increases to employee contributions and want to redesign the plan so that benefits are reduced. Relationships can become frayed as employers remove benefits from the non-represented people in their companies. This has already happened at 2 of our larger employers in society. And that makes the managers pretty cranky when they come to the bargaining table because we're trying to preserve something valuable and important that they have lost. The third bullet here, it appears on a lot of lists, mostly on insurance company websites. So I'm not sure I put a lot of stock in that, although most people will try to work until they're entitled to an unreduced pension, but many people work longer than that anyway because they just simply have expenses or accrue more service. There are some advantages, particularly in specific individual circumstances to defined contribution plans. They're certainly easy to understand. I should qualify before I go further that this comparison here on this slide is only valid for the most common type of defined contribution plan, which is a member-directed plan. These are called capital accumulation plans, and we'll talk more about those tomorrow. It's also true that there are always some people who believe that they can achieve better results by managing their own individual defined contribution pension account, but it is very difficult for even the most sophisticated investor to outstrip the power of longevity pooling that defined benefit or target benefit plans provide. Also, this is an interesting issue on the bottom of the list, simpler accounting for employers. Defined benefit accounting has become a real headache for employers, not only because of the complexity, but because recent rule changes have required them to show the entirety of the pension deficit on their balance sheets and also on their P&L. And there's a lot of controversy around that. Many of us believe that it's wrong to be showing a balance sheet deficit for a debt that will not be called anytime soon. These plans have an extremely long tail, but what it does is on paper, it makes private sector companies look like they have no equity when in fact, in real life, they really do. Nothing's changed except the accounting rule. But employers are increasingly looking for that simplicity of defined contribution accounting, which is just simply one line item on their P&L and they're done. On the downside for defined contribution plans, the biggest one being that you just simply don't know what your pension income is going to be in retirement because it depends on how your investments perform. The employee bears all of the risk and responsibility of managing not only their DC account when they are working, but also their pension after they retire. There's no inflation protection except for investment returns. And they're inefficient because where there are individual accounts, you have to plan for maximum longevity and you might need to de-risk. There have been, as I mentioned before, a lot of poor results with these plans in producing stable, adequate retirement income. And there has been case law in the United States where employers have really been exposed to litigation in cases what we call negligent misrepresentation. And this is where an employer eager to replace perhaps a defined benefit plan with a defined contribution plan will produce education materials and that overpromise on these defined contribution plans in terms of what they can produce. And I would argue that some of the tools that we have in society locals today overpromise as well and are very misleading. So employers have to be extremely careful about that. And these issues will be addressed in our session tomorrow. But the good news is the pension community is focused on improving outcomes in the defined contribution space. A lot of work has been done and the work continues. So I'd now like to turn this over to Renee, who hopefully has been looking at some questions and fielding some questions to see if there's anything that we can answer for you today.
I'm coming, Laura. Sorry, I'm just starting to try to start my video here. My screen is bouncing around. 1 second. Okay, so I did have one question that came up, and I believe that it was asked to me directly. So I'm just going to remind folks that both the session from earlier in April that Laura was talking about before, she referenced it, the defined benefit pension 101 sessions that were run in early April will also be posted on the Society's e-learning website. Anybody who registered for either this session or the defined benefit session will receive a notification once the sessions are posted to let you know how to access that site, but it is available and accessible to all Society members. So do we have any questions for Laura? Okay, there is a question here, Laura. So creditors have access to our DB pension plan. Should OPG go bankrupt? I thought it was a separate pot of money vested or protected from creditors.
Well, Ralph is right. It is. The money in the pension fund is held in trust. There have been attempts by employers, most recently in a Supreme Court decision called Indilex, to call that into question. It's always challenging in the context of insolvency because the debtor in possession, a bank, wants to be first in line in terms of getting the spoils from an insolvency. But the really good news is that any money that's in the plan, and additionally any contributions that are owing to the plan, are held in trust and cannot be touched by the other creditors. The bad news is that many of us on the labor side would love to see the shortfall also given priority in bankruptcy. It's controversial because there's always a concern that that companies will actually liquidate and go bankrupt as opposed to restructuring, and that can have adverse employment impacts that can pit active employees against pensioners and those kinds of situations. So it is controversial, but certainly there have been attempts to bring into the trust what we call a deemed trust of the funding shortfall. In cases like Sears, we saw some really shocking examples of where the employer was they were giving executive bonuses and then share buybacks and putting the money anywhere except back into the pension plan, which resulted in a severely underfunded plan. And certainly legislative steps are being contemplated to try and interfere with those bad acts. But it's unclear whether giving the shortfall priority in insolvency is a good idea. Certainly the labor organizations and the pensioner groups support that. But just again, to be clear, to Ralph's question, it's absolutely true that the money that is in the plan or even currently owing to the plan in terms of a payment schedule is protected, is in trust, and your pension cannot just be poached by other creditors. Very good question.
Thanks,
But
Laura.
that's for defined benefit plans. Now for defined contribution plans, it's just your money. Nobody can take it from you. And
The
that
one upside, one of the upsides to the
one of the
defined.
upside, it's just
Yeah.
your money. They can't take it. That's
But like you said earlier, for the majority of our locals anyway, at the society, the risk of bankruptcy is probably not that significant in the DB locals.
That's true, and it's really been exciting to see Energy, which was a smaller employer, and we're hoping soon that New Horizon will be repatriated into OPG. And these are cases of consolidation, which are very, very good for the plan members, because you're moving from a smaller company where insolvency might be an issue into a large, secure pension plan. Having said that, the attacks never stop at the bargaining table. Hydro One has eliminated defined benefit pensions for all of their newly hired managers. All of them. It's just gone. So that makes them real hungry when they come to bargain with us.
Yeah. Okay, so another question for you is, what do you think the relevance is, Laura, of the target benefit plan structure for the society going forward? Like, I don't believe we have any locals currently with target benefit.
The relevance is, and this is what we're going to get into in much more detail tomorrow, is that they are a much better option than defined contribution in terms of delivering an adequate, secure retirement income outcome. And this is because of the pooling. And so, the real beauty of these target plans is that they don't come at any additional cost to the employers. So, for the same, if the employer's been paying 5%, 8%, 9% into your pension plan now, and you might be matching that as a defined contribution participant, those same dollars can go into a target plan and literally produce twice the bang for the buck, which is, there are actually reports called that, bang for the buck, demonstrating. And all of that comes from the power of longevity pooling, investment risk pooling, professional management, economies of scale, all of those things that just produce significantly better pension outcomes. And that is why they are relevant, because we do now increasingly have members in defined contribution plans. And we're constantly pitching the target option as a better option that there's really no good reason for employers to say no to. They find reasons, but there's no good reason.
There's no good one.
There's no good reason.
Another question for you here. Sorry, 1 second. I'm just going to scroll up. Would it be possible for any of our locals that have a DB plan to move to a DC plan on the whim of the provincial government?
Well, in the defined benefit sessions that we held earlier this month, I walked the group through the recent history of various attempts by the provincial government to maybe not change to defined contribution, but to severely water down the pension plans in the electricity sector. The provincial government commissioned a report that came out in 2014, written by Jim Leach of Ontario Teachers Pension fame, who recommended significant cuts to electricity sector pension plans. Things quieted down, with COVID. Do I think the attack and the pressure is going to go away? I mean, the government even sent their own government representative in the form of a human being from McCarthy Tetro to sit down at our bargaining tables. And as a result, for the power workers and the society, at all of the successor, or most, the public sector successor Ontario Hydro plans, so OPG, Hydro One, ISO, all were forced to accept changes to plan design that reduced the pension benefits. So are they coming for us? They have in the past. And I can only think that they will again, because these defined benefit plans are increasingly rare, and it's taxpayers paying for them in many respects. So yeah, I think we have to remain absolutely vigilant. Okay,
another question here. Does it make sense? This is from Shane. So Shane is asking, does it make sense to pull your money out at retirement? What are the pros and cons of taking out money at retirement?
Well, as we so often do, I am going to direct that individual to a financial planner, because every situation is going to be different. Now, some of our defined benefit, this is now a defined benefit question. Some of our plans permit taking the commuted value of your pension out at retirement. Some of them do not. Some of them place an age limit on it of age 65. So again, employers aren't crazy about that. Sometimes plan members aren't even crazy about that. The power workers have consistently taken a negative view of commuted value transfers, not only because it puts the individual then in charge of managing that lump sum of money, but also because, you know, it's a hit on the plan too, because you're taking the value out at 100% of the what we call the solvency rate. And so that's costly for the plan as well. So, but again, where that option is available and where the companies can afford it and where individual circumstances dictate, it is there for some plans.
Okay, and I have two more questions here, Laura. So one is, I'm assuming this is from Alex, who I believe is part of a DB plan. He's asking, can we take part of the pension and keep part of the pension in the pool? Is that possible?
For our defined benefit plan, there's a provision for transferring just part of the commuted value of your pension out for any service before 1987. But as you can imagine, that's becoming an increasingly rare scenario as time marches on. So yeah, for the most part, it's one or the other.
Okay.
Either take the value of your pension or you take your monthly benefit.
Okay. And then another question here, would you be able to give any information on medical benefits in retirement? Is that part of general plan or is it company specific?
Well, the health and dental benefits are not part of the plan per se, not part of the pension plan, but many of our collective agreements link the health and dental benefits to what the pensioner's status is. So there's been case law around this. We've had arbitrations around it. It is not uniform across the locals. So you need to talk to your unit director to get an answer to your specific circumstance. So the answer is, in some companies, if you take the commuted value of your pension, you will not get your health and dental benefits. In others, there's a vesting period where you need to have 10 years of service or even 15 years of service before you get it. But these are all bargained issues. So not part of the pension plan, but often linked to the pension plan.
Okay, and there's a question from Dave. I'm going to add a second question to this just for folks that may not be aware. What is COLA and how does COLA work?
Well, COLA, I believe, refers to a provision in a collective agreement that you may or may not have. Some of our collective agreements have them, and of course, in this crazy inflationary environment we're in right now, it's a beautiful thing. On the other hand, we've got many of our employers have been subject to Bill 124 and to 1% caps on their total compensation increases in bargaining. So that can put a real damper on that as well. And as far as how it works, it really varies from, you have to read the specific language of your collective agreement. Sometimes there's it doesn't kick in until inflation rises above a certain level that might be 3%. So it really does vary, but in many cases, we don't have those COLA clauses at all.
Okay. One more second. Let me just see if I have any other questions in here. I don't think so. I know that a few folks have reached out to me directly asking or noting that, I guess, when Laura put the slides up showing which locals had which type of pension. And then I guess in the beginning, when Laura had introduced this, just reminding everybody that this is a defined contribution session, that, you know, you're welcome to stay. But I think a lot of folks kind of realize that they may have wanted to attend the defined benefit sessions. That's fine. Again, both sessions will be posted on the e-learning site. They will both be posted this week. So you will have access to both today's session and tomorrow's session, plus the ones from earlier this month. I think for the most part, Laura, like, I'm not sure if you wanted to speak a little bit about what you'll be talking about tomorrow, so that I know you've mentioned it kind of throughout, but just so folks that I've had a few folks reach out asking, you know, what things are we covering tomorrow, or suggesting that perhaps they may not attend tomorrow given that they're part of a DB plan. So.
Right, and when we saw the attendance list, we anticipated that there might be some of that. Yes, tomorrow's session is specifically about defined contribution pension plans and group RSPs, and we do have a number of members who have that sort of plan, and we'll certainly be doing some outreach to try and make it as easy as possible for them to attend. Renee, I do have one question from an individual who came directly to me, and the question is kind of roughly, why are we doing this? I did speak, I mean, the individual is asking whether there are employers pressures to change the structure of our plans. Absolutely, at every round of bargaining, there are those pressures. But also, we're having these sessions because there's just a huge level of interest. You know, it was interesting when we first posted the invitation to the defined benefit sessions held earlier this month. The spaces were gone in less than a minute. I mean, there's just a really high level of interest because these things are complicated. They're an extremely important part of your compensation, and we just want to help people understand better. And I think it's important, if you do have time to attend tomorrow, to understand the more you hear about these defined contribution plans and group RSPs, the more you're going to understand the incredible value that your defined benefit plans provide. And for those that are currently in defined contribution or group RSP, we'll be talking quite a bit about these target benefit alternatives that you could and should be presenting to your employers as a way for them at no additional cost or risk to provide a much better retirement outcome for their employees. So that will be tomorrow's focus.
I think it's really important for folks to understand the difference between defined benefit and defined contribution. Even if you're in defined benefit, like Laura's mentioned before, I don't think that there's been a round of bargaining. You know, at most of the locals will be able to tell you that, you know, at least once or twice at the bargaining table, if not every time at the bargaining table, the employer always puts forward some form of change. And it's not always beneficial. In some cases, like at New Horizons and at Energy, for example, you know, there was a huge push to have any new member that was join a DC plan or have the option to join a DC plan. So it's important for folks to understand what's at risk when your bargaining team comes to you, or if your bargaining team comes to you and says things like, you know, the employer keeps pushing, or like Laura said, one of the locals was at Hydro One, Laura, has moved to a DC plan for management now.
Yes.
So you can, they will for sure use that as a, you know, well, we've already moved the management team, right? That doesn't mean that the society will say, okay, yeah, we think that's a great idea. Of course not, but it's important for members to really understand the difference. Like Laura said, so you have an appreciation for that value that comes with the defined benefit plan and where the risks are and some of the holes are with some of the other plans. So.
Well, there's also pressure on plan design elements because at another one of our locals with another employer, for the non-represented people, the managers, they didn't take them out of the defined benefit plan, but they dramatically reduced the benefits. They have 75% indexing. They have a rule of 90 instead of rule of 82 or even 85. I mean, they basically just took every provision and took it down to the lowest level possible, which dramatically reduced the value of those pensions.
Yeah.
And so, like I said, then you get into bargaining, and of course, if you're in mediation arbitration, you're telling, you know, the employer's counsel is pointing out to the arbitrator all of this, and the arbitrator correctly most of the time is just simply saying, that's not really relevant here. but still, it's, you know, it's sort of like saying the jury will please disregard the question. They don't really, right?
Yes, yeah, no, for sure. Okay, I don't see any further questions. In the DB sessions at the beginning of the month, what we did was I stayed on the call and I left it open for anybody who would like to ask questions. I will continue to monitor the chat for about 15 minutes. So if you're just kind of mulling through, we know that there is a ton of information that you've just been presented with. So if you're kind of mulling through and have questions, but you're trying to formulate them, that's not a problem. I will remain on the call until around 1:15 for folks to just simply ask questions in the chat. So, and if there's anything else, Laura and I are here for a couple more minutes, but the presentation for today is done. If we receive more questions before 1:15-ish, then I will go ahead and Laura will actually answer those perhaps at the beginning of the call tomorrow, so that way, if there are questions remaining from today, you get the answers before we carry on into tomorrow's content. So. Yeah, if you have other things to do, thank you so much for joining us. We know this was your lunch, and we appreciate that some of you have DB plans, not DC. So you are welcome to hang in, or your presentation is over. So we'll see you all tomorrow. Oh, here, Laura, I do have one more question. Do you have a few minutes?
I do.
Okay, so this is a question. Do you know what the indexing rules / formulas are for OPG pensioners?
Roughly, yes. So I think for all of the successor legacy Ontario Hydro plans, the formula is the same, and it is 100% of the change in the consumer price index year over year from July 1st of one year to July 1st of the next. So what this means is they're taking a snapshot of what the change was on a specific date, and that's going to result in fluctuations, so that one year it might be really low, but it's going to be recaptured the next year, so that over time it should reflect the actual change in inflation. But that's the formula, that's how it works. And it is guaranteed. It isn't something we have to go back and bargain every year. Capped at 8%, which actually I should mention that, because in this crazy inflationary environment, we could actually get there.
It's just nuts to even consider. I should mention, I think you had suggested earlier in response to the question about the medical benefits that folks should reach out to their unit directors. If you are on the call and you are not sure who your unit director is, please feel free to email or message me directly, and I can happily connect you with your unit director's name or your delegate's name.
And those rules and provisions will be, if not in the collective agreement, definitely in the health and dental brochure, which should be available to you on your intranet sites as well.
And HR, normally through the HR site, I think they typically have the benefits brochure. Oh, sorry, Dave had asked. Okay, sorry, 1 second, Dave. Dave had asked what was the website about the treaties. It's native, NATIVE, land, LAND.ca. And Ralph has another question. I think you mentioned earlier that if it is low, like 1%, the pension indexing will be delayed.
No, it's never delayed, but it just might be low for that period at that snapshot of time. But I've never heard of a situation where they've withheld the indexation adjustment.
Okay. Well, we're at 1 o'clock, so I'm going to stop asking Laura questions, but I will continue to take questions from folks. Ralph has said thank you. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. And like I said, I will be here till around 1:15 for anybody that would like to post questions in the chat, and we'll start tomorrow's session with that. Otherwise, have a wonderful afternoon, and hopefully we'll see you back tomorrow. Thanks so much, Laura.
Okay, very welcome.